she's trying to say Democrats are just too on the side of workers. I was debatable, and I was also under the impression that the GOP were undergoing this populist pro-worker rebranding.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
The Republicans, they took control of the House of Representatives, and one of the first things that they did was a bill to defund enforcement of the law. That was their first bill that they passed. But the thing that they did, one of the things that they did before that was reorganization of the committees. And one of the committees, and we talked about this last week, was the House Committee on Education and Labor. They changed the name to the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. And I was prepping for this segment a little bit because I wanted to talk about their statement that they put out regarding this. I wasn't originally going to do like a longer segment about it, but they did a pretty lengthy statement about it, and there's just some really silly things in the statement. And so I was doing some research yesterday for this, and I found out that this committee was originally commissioned under Republicans. You know, they always, one of their big things of conservatives right now is, oh, Democrats were the real racists. Democrats were the party of the KKK. Republicans were the party of Lincoln. Well, guess what the Republican Party of Lincoln did in 1867? They created the House Committee on Education and Labor. The House Committee on Education and Labor, and it stayed that name as far as I can tell. I didn't just spend hours and hours, looking at every single Congress, but from what I could tell, it stayed that way. The name that Republicans originally gave it until 1995, when Republicans first changed it to the House Committee on Education and something else, and then finally in like 97 or 99, they changed it to Education and the Workforce, which is what they've stuck with every time they take the House. Education and the Workforce since then, while Democrats have tried to stay true to American history and keep the politically correct mob from erasing our heritage and using this newspeak, Education and the Workforce, right? I mean, wow, this is just like 1987's George Orwell's. This is exactly like George Orwell predicted in 1987.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's exactly like that.
Yeah,
What's happening right now?
I'm sure you probably heard it on the radio.
Yeah, so
has to be true.
Has to be true. So here's what they said. On their, they made this big statement about, we're changing the name because we're, politically correct. We want to make sure that we don't offend anybody by calling it the House Committee on Education and Labor, even though that's what it was called for nearly 200 years, or like 130 years. We want to make sure that we don't offend anybody, any bosses. We want to make sure we don't offend any bosses. I'm going to call it Education and the Workforce. Here's what they said. Each time the majority in the House of Representatives flips between Democrats and Republicans, the name of this committee changes. When Democrats control the House, the name is Committee on Education and Labor, while Republicans rebrand it as the Committee on Education and the Workforce. But why does that matter? This is, remember, Republicans talking. Quote, labor, unquote, is an antiquated term that excludes individuals. And I just want to stop and think about how this language is so like PC wokey police language. Oh, it excludes individuals. The term labor excludes, this is the kind of language that these same people would totally decry if we were talking about, a trans woman wanting to be called, Miss Jones, instead of like being an asshole and calling them their dead name, right? I mean, this is, they would be totally against this type of revisionism if it were anything else. Quote, labor, unquote, is an antiquated term that excludes individuals who contribute to the American workforce but aren't classified as conventional employees. Quote, labor, unquote, also carries a negative connotation, does it? That ignores the dignity of work. The term is something out of a Marxist textbook that fails to capture the accomplishments of the full spectrum of the American workforce. Okay, I don't think labor ignores the dignity of work. In fact, I think the people who are most attached to the term labor, unions, working people, the people that fight on behalf of working people, they will agree that most of them will agree that there's some amount of dignity in work. There's some amount of pride that working people, particularly union folks, craftsmen, tradespeople, there's a certain amount of pride that they have in the work that they do.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
You know, I mean, you can talk about it even better than, because I think, Adam, you know, your work product is much more visible than mine as, you know, as like a clickety-clack office worker, right? But, you know, I mean, you putting together these shows that we do in Huntsville as a union stagehand, you know, I mean, there's a certain amount of pride that you see when you know, get up and you see this, you know, famous musician performing in front of a crowd of hundreds or thousands and be like, this couldn't have happened without me.
Right, yeah. And I mean, locals take pride and want to, like, when folks come to Huntsville, IATSE 900 wants them to leave with a good impression. We want them to go to their next stop on the tour thinking, man, those folks in Huntsville really knew what they were doing. We had a great show. They put it together well. And if you talk to electricians, you talk to plumbers, you talk to any of the trades folks, they have a similar pride in their work, both on a personal level and also on behalf of their local and their brothers and sisters on the job. Yeah. But it's not just in the trades. It's in, you know, industrial unions. It's anywhere. I think most working people take pride in their work ethic and do the best they can to work hard, given the circumstances they're in.
Right.
Now, the problem is, of course, not all jobs lend themselves to the dignity of work, and they certainly don't lend themselves to the dignity of the worker. But that's, you know, obviously a separate conversation from what our Republican friend in Congress is trying to discuss.
Back to their statement, the left prefers the term labor. Actually, you know, just everybody preferred the term labor until these, you know, woke bosses wanted to try to rebrand, as they called it, right? This was just what it was called. This is just what it was, is labor. Because it creates a sense of enmity between employees and employers, which union bosses, love that phrase, and left-wing activists seek to stoke for political gain. This word also fails to capture how deeply intertwined workers and job creators are in their contributions to the economy. I love how they call elected union officials who are accountable to the membership and who have legal responsibilities to the union and who can be arrested for not being democratic enough. They call these people union bosses, but they call literal actual bosses, quote unquote, job creators. You have to love the doublespeak here. You have to love it. Though the left likes to treat employers like predators, we know that most job creators have their employees' best interests in mind. That's fascinating. Our economy would not function without the earnest cooperation of both employees and employers. That's why workforce is such a valuable term. In Representative Virginia Fox's own words, quote, workforce is a much better term to use because we are talking about all the people in this country who make a living. The American workforce encompasses or is built upon many different components: independent contracting, workers, blue-collar workers, and franchise ownership.
Franchise ownership? No, I'm sorry. Man. You don't get to steal our valor. You are not a worker as a franchise owner.
Yeah.
You are not labor. You don't count, and you don't get to steal our valor. Sorry.
Using labor in the name of the committee omits the important contributions of many segments of our economy and inadvertently ignores the dignity of the work of these individuals. Republicans understand that for many Americans, work creates a sense of dignity and purpose, which has never been challenged. Work creates opportunities for Americans to earn a living, support families, and strive toward a greater purpose. Many workers also receive important benefits from their jobs, such as employer-sponsored health care. Language matters. Using outdated terms like labor creates an overt bias towards union bosses while widening fissures created by big labor between workers and employers. If we want a modern workforce, we should say as much in Congress. That begins with ensuring our name reflects our commitment to every individual contributing to our workforce, the Committee on Education and the Workforce.
Big labor. Huh?
Big labor. Big labor.
Big labor, but yet I noticed she doesn't say big employers.
Yeah, right.
You know, the people who actually
like have all the money.
The economy.
Right.
The people who own the economy, who run the economy, who set prices, who set production, who own the means of production and run the means of production. They're just job creators. It's that big labor. You got to watch out for it. All 10% of us. Got to watch out.
Yeah, it's just super, super bonkers. I told you that we had talked about her before, the person who, and so Representative Virginia Fox is like now the chair of this committee, the committee on this new, woke term, Committee on Education and the Workforce.
God, that's reassuring.
Yeah. She is the chair now. She's a Republican from Virginia. So, if she's...
Wait, she's from Virginia and her name is Virginia? Is that correct?
Is that correct? I don't know. Now you're making me question. I don't know. But her last name is Fox, and she's the chair, and I think she's from Virginia.
And she sucks.
But so here's a question. She says in her statement that she wants the name to reflect our commitment to every individual contributing to our workforce. Presumably, at least, if we're going to take this at face value, we would say that you're committed to workers, at least in the same proportion that you are committed to bosses, right? I mean, at minimum, you should really be committed more to workers because just by, virtue of the fact that there are, thousands of times more workers than bosses, And so, if you're going to be committed to every individual equally, you're going to have to be committed to workers as a class more than bosses because there's just more of us because we actually, do the work. So I said that we had talked about her before, and we talked about her in the context of a hearing on Starbucks union busting, where Michelle Eisen, an actual real-life Starbucks barista, somebody who actually makes profit for Starbucks, who actually creates value for the economy, who actually does something, she was there in Congress. And so Representative Virginia Fox had the opportunity to speak to one of the individuals that she's saying she's got a commitment to. So let's see how she opens. Let's just remember, we played this clip before, but let's remember how she opens how she opens her statements and her address during this hearing.
Despite Democrats' aggressive attempts to force union representation on workers, Republicans are committed to ensuring workers have the freedom to choose whether they want to join a union. I'd like to remind my colleagues that federal law already protects the right of employees to organize or to refrain from doing so. Any reforms to our labor laws should help workers and spur economic growth, not exclusively promote the interests of union bosses. There's a reason why the PRO Act cannot clear the Senate. It is a deeply unpopular bill that undermines basic, long-standing worker rights and would take a wrecking ball to Main Street. Republicans just want fair and neutral labor laws. Instead of working together to create a level playing field, Democrats want to pass a union wish list bill to build on what they claim is a historic surge in unionizing.
So all she wants is just fair labor laws. And yet, if the thing that she's trying to say is that Democrats are just too on the side of workers, which, is, I was
debatable. to say the least.
Debatable to say the least. And I was also under the impression that the GOP, that the Republicans were undergoing this populist pro-worker rebranding. Despite the fact that Josh Hawley literally doesn't think that pregnant workers should have access to water. That's the impression that I'm being given by the mainstream media is that Republicans are undergoing this populist rebranding, and yet here she is trying to say that Democrats are too committed to workers. But you would think that, okay, look, here's the deal. If I'm gonna say Democrats need to be fair, you would think I would at least concede some of the most obvious discrepancies in our labor law, some of the most obvious unfair things that bosses are able to get away with, and try to work with Democrats to address those. You would think, because that's just a fact. It's just a fact that bosses have more power than workers. And it's just a fact that it didn't used to be that way. I mean, it's always been that way, but not in the proportion that it is today. It's just a fact. It's just a fact that bosses can get away with more things than workers. And one of those things is, let's look at what UPS can do. Matt Leikinger on Twitter, he is a UPS driver, and he recorded a video of UPS supervisors scabbing on the nurses in violation of their collective bargaining agreement with the Teamsters. The Teamsters and UPS have a collective bargaining agreement that states that UPS will not deliver across picket lines. That's in their agreement, and so that means it's binding. UPS has agreed to that, and now that's supposedly enforceable by law. And yet here this UPS driver is recording supervisors delivering to this hospital that is on strike, crossing the picket line to do so. And yet the consequences for UPS scabbing on the strike is only, according to Matt, going to be an insignificant amount of money paid in the form of a grievance check to a Teamster member. And the process of getting this grievance paid is going to take literal actual years. Literal actual years. Whereas if Matt tried to take it on himself to enforce the contract and bodily put himself in front of them and not allow them to cross, he would be arrested. He would be arrested, even though he's trying to get them to enforce the law. But cops aren't going to arrest supervisors for scabbing, even though it's technically against the law because they're violating their contract, which is supposed to be legally binding. That's something that's obviously unbalanced. In that hearing, she heard from a Starbucks barista about how Starbucks workers are being retaliated against in violation of the law. In violation of the law. There were 7 Memphis, Tennessee baristas who were fired, and it took 9 months to get them reinstated. It was found that they were illegally fired for retaliation. Like a Republican circuit court judge found it.
Right.
Okay, so this is not, I understand and cop to being a pro-worker partisan, okay? But I also try very hard, I do try very hard not to misrepresent anything. I do not lie, but I also want to make clear when it's not just pro-worker partisans that are saying this stuff. This is a Republican judge in Tennessee that is saying this, that said that these Memphis baristas were unlawfully fired and ordered Starbucks to reinstate them, which they did 9 months later. 9 months. How long would it take for the law to come after you if you did so much damage, if you did as much damage to an individual as 9 months without a paycheck? Which would be what? Tens of thousands of dollars? $10,000, $15,000 potentially? $20,000? If I went into your house and did $10,000 to $15,000, $20,000 worth of damage, would it take 9 months for the process to work itself out? For me to be punished? No, of course not.
I'll give you, just a practical example of something that I dealt with all the time representing public school employees. From time to time, you would find where an employee had been overpaid, right, through some mistake, some accounting error, whatever it may have been. And boy, when they found out, they got all of their money back, often all in one lump sum, in one check. I will never forget a custodian having that happen to them. They had been overpaid slightly for a couple years, actually. It was not enough to really notice on each individual check, but when you added it up over time, it was a substantial amount to be deducted all at once. They didn't care that this custodian wasn't sure how they were going to keep their lights on that month, right? That they weren't going to be able to pay their bills that month. They made sure they got all their money back. They clawed it back so fast, as Infinite Content wrote in the chat. I mean, very quick about clawing back that money. The flip side to it, when employees would come to me because they've been underpaid in some cases for years, totally different story. It would be months and months of going through grievances. If that's not working, trying to lawyer up, see if we can get lawyers to scare them into doing the right thing. Sometimes even that wouldn't work. Then you do have to go to court and hope that you get the right judge, hope that you can actually make some headway in court, and hope that maybe after a year or two, your problem is actually resolved.
Right.
Maybe. Right? That is the difference between when an employee is overpaid versus an employee being underpaid.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real practical demonstration of the balance of power in our workplaces.
But she's not interested in rectifying any of that. The only thing, and this is the crux, right? This is the crux. If you ever hear about any change to workplace dynamics that Republicans support, ask yourself who it benefits. Does it disproportionately benefit workers or bosses? It's always, always, always bosses. And that's the rub. That's the rub.
Right.
So it's obviously, they're not interested in a fair law, in fair law for working people. It's just a silly thing to believe. It's a silly thing to believe.
Well, and I'll also add, to sort of riff off a comment we got in the chat from Free American 2020. He said, shame we had House, Senate, and Pres and did nothing for worker safety. Maybe next time they will promise us.
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah, I think, just to reiterate, our criticism of the GOP does not absolve the Democratic Party whatsoever. And I would agree with that assessment. In the past 2 years, we've seen very, very little done to advance the interest and the goals of working class people, including safety on the job. We have seen an improvement in the National Labor Relations Board, an improvement with the head of the FTC. There's a couple of little things you can point to here and there, but all in all, it's
but it really is.
It's like drops in a bucket, right? It's nowhere near what needs to be done, considering the drastic imbalance of power and imbalance of wealth, imbalance of law. It's just so much needs to be done, and the Republicans are making it clear they're going to make it worse, and Democrats have made it clear that they weren't up for the task.
It really is amazing that some of the smaller things, like all of these, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit later in the program, but all these executive agencies that are tasked with enforcing labor law, workplace safety, all this stuff, all of these things have been underfunded. OSHA, we talked to an AFGE member, I believe, who works for OSHA about the underfunding at OSHA. We've talked
EEOC. That's another one.
EEOC, maybe that's what I was thinking of. EEOC is another one. We talked to a field attorney at the NLRB about these, and so I do not understand. It's not a controversial thing for Democrats to fund these these agencies to enforce the law.
Well, it's controversial among some in the donor class,
Right.
but it should not be controversial by and large, though. You're right.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.